Welcome to FedSavvy Strategies Let's GovConsider It, where we explore all things GovCon with industry experts. We're excited to welcome Dr. Dolores Kuchina-Musina to discuss the pros and cons of government contracting versus commercial and some of the tough questions you need to ask yourself before approaching any market.
Hear about talking about contracts, right? So government contracts and the exciting world thereof. I mean, it's interesting because people talk about contracts, but do we really define what it really is, right? And any sort of contract is if you want to be I'll put on my amateur attorney hat here. And by the way, I'm not an attorney, just we're all clear on this part. I'm not an attorney. I'm married to one, but I'm not an attorney myself. So she might chastise me on this a little bit, but that's okay. I'm used to it. So, I mean, it's an agreement, right? It's an agreement between two parties to do something in exchange for something else, right? That's the most fundamental part of what a contract is. Two parties agree, I will deliver this service and or product, and you will pay me something for that service of what we're giving you, value that. And that's very, I mean, in the public sector space, it's certainly a lot of different dynamics of how a contract works, how it's set up. And we're going to get into some of that here, different types of contracts and different things. I know, Dolores, you've got some expertise that's unique, and I think I come from maybe more of a traditional, FAR-based contracting background, which is where I've spent the majority of my career. But that's what it comes down to, right? So, and we as in the GovCon space are trying to sell our wares to the U.S. government to satisfy a mission, to satisfy some mission need that serves the public good, right? That's what I think. That's maybe a non-attorney based way of defining it, but that's kind of how I see it. What's your take, Dolores? I'm curious.
Yeah, I think you covered that really, really well. And I know through different jargon and making sure that we're using the right terminology and things like that, there's a lot of conversation about what is the difference between contract, agreement in the government space. And just to simplify it for everyone, just from the contract law standpoint, is that it is an agreement between two parties for you to be able to do something or purchase something in exchange for something else. And that might be something of monetary value, that might be money, that might be an agreement that you two will do something, but there has to be agreement, there has to be consideration that's put on the table. When it comes to government contracts, I think where people have to be very careful is the biggest difference is it's not your direct money that you are spending. It is your tax dollar money that is being spent by the government on your behalf in order for the government to either work more efficiently or for the government to be able to get services or something in order to provide a public good or a service that will overall benefit, the citizens of the country and anyone that is here or anyone that is supporting the government or in the government. So there's a higher standard that the government has to use in order for them to make sure that they're using these tax dollars, not only responsibly, but according to what they're saying they're going to use it for. And it's a lot of money. If you look at the government budget, the amount has gone up and up and up, and the amount that we're spending on things is going up. Respectively with inflation and all the other economic forces that are pushing it that way. But the question is always, it's not money that you are directly paying out of your wallet that you can actually see. It's a percentage that all of us have pitched in. And so there are rules, there are guidelines, there's terminology that we use in everyday jargon on the government side to make sure that we're all on the same page in the way that we use it. And some of it is the same with commercial practices. Some of it is different. But essentially, that is the biggest difference between what is a contract between a government entity and like commercial to commercial. And it's that you're using tax dollar money or public funds in order for the government to operate.
Right. I think you put it much more eloquently than I did. No, seriously, it was that I think the way but also there's the way you characterize it is important people understand. And this is where I actually kind of get, I find sometimes some very cringe-worthy statements people will make. Well, look at all the money out there to take. Well, yeah, the U.S. government is gigantic. It is absolutely a behemoth. It's arguably the largest buying entity on the planet. But the money comes out of our pocket, and it's to do public good. So, and there's nothing wrong with the business making money and being profitable. That's part of capitalism. It's part of a free market economy. That's who we are. and generates wealth, it generates economic benefit for everyone, that's a good thing. I believe in that. I really do believe in that's a good thing. However, you need to be making sure that you're actually solving a public problem, right? It's not just graft and blatant graft where you're taking advantage of it. You're solving a mission problem. You're also maybe saving lives. You may be making Americans' lives better. You should be in some way, shape, or form. And that's something that we can never lose sight of. It sounds very preachy, but when you're spending taxpayer dollars, you're trying to benefit the entire American people, which is something I think you don't go into government contracting to become stupid rich, right? There are no Facebook or Google millionaires or billionaires in this space. You're doing so because you're trying to, right, create some sort of economic benefit for people, but also to better the good of how the country works.
Yeah, and I think to that point, that is why there's this need of those pesky compliance rules or this goodness factor that has
Mhm.
to go into these types of contracts between, government and commercial entities, where the government has to ensure that this private entity is going to do right by not only the public but also by the government in the way that they're spending their money. Nothing precludes commercial businesses from doing the same, of saying like, hey, we want to ensure that there's cybersecurity standards instilled. We want to make sure that this food that we're buying is edible. Those are things that we benefit from government passing the policy, passing the regulations for us to follow. And reporting isn't new. I know we gripe about government reporting because there's like 17 websites you have to go to, whether you're government or industry, to report. But reporting on the commercial side, you have to do the same thing. There's a lot of times where you have to do projection, forecasting, in order for you to make sure that you are showing, that you are spending the money in accordance, that you're not going to run out early. So I think because of just human nature, you think that this is a unique problem to government contracting, of all these like pesky compliance pieces. They're just written out publicly for everyone to see. While on the commercial side, I would say it's something that we know as like best practices, or we know as the universal uniform commercial code, or we know that as something that is industry standard or something like that, where we are reporting based on, or maybe based on federal, state, or local, or international regulations on some of the stuff that you have to report on, especially with like special minerals or raw sources, agriculture, things like that. So I want to make that point because every time we talk about government contracting, it always boils down to compliance, accounting, cybersecurity, all the like I would put in quotes annoying things, that make us feel like they're overburdensome. But you have to account for the fact that the intention of the government is that they are doing right by the public. And it's really hard to come up with language in a policy that's going to be broad enough that it will apply to everything that could happen, but also specific enough for them to get the outcome that they're looking for. And so that's where they look to the public to say, this is unrealistic. That's where we can go in and we can comment on these regulations. But I just wanted to notate that because I can already hear people like thinking, they're like, what about all this reporting I have to do every single year?
Yeah.
Well, you probably have to do that on the commercial side. You just don't see it as vividly because you're not logging into a portal with, a 14-character password that expires every 30 seconds that you have to do two-factor authentication to get into. But it's still there. It's still prevalent, and it's still a requirement regardless.
Yeah, I think it's an important the compliance part. Yes, that can be obnoxious, and we're both business owners, so we live that. I know I live through the variety of compliance things I've got to do. But the flip side, though, this is where people often, I think, go and why would I not do a commercial contract over a government contract? Well, there's pros and cons to both, right? So I think
Mhm.
let's think the flip side of the business case for it. As much as we may want to malign regulation and all the stuff it involves and what a hassle it can be, here's reality. if I have a prime contract with some U.S. government agency, what can I expect? Let's say if it's a FAR-based one, those FAR protections, yes, it governs what you do as the contract, but it also gives you protections. So it
Mhm.
keeps the government in check if they do some things that are inappropriate. So that it applies both ways. Other parts about it, though, is that where do you see in the commercial world that you can get a 5-year contract where you can predict your revenue with a relative level of certainty? If I could predict 5 years of revenue from my business, I'd be doing cartwheels in the street. I would be rejoicing and singing songs, which you don't want to hear, by the way, but I'd be rejoicing because you have that level of long-term engagement, long-term business that
Mhm.
yes, things can go foul, things can go south, options may not be exercised, something doesn't happen, whatever the funding dries up for a program, some political headwinds change, and that's always a possibility. I mean, but you
Right.
can't, but there's a number of things can happen that unravel your best business deal, but that's important to understand. And even though, let's say, the profitability may be lower than in a commercial market, I think that, and this is also why I think we see a lot of private equity continuing to pour their interest into this space, is because it's large scale work, large scale contracts, long-term contracts that I can begin to build a business case around and invest in with a higher level of confidence. Because as much as we might want to dismay the future, the reality is likely the United States will not fall apart the seams and become 50 individual states and sort of a medieval fiefdom again. It's pretty
Mhm.
stable. So there are some things to be said there, which is why I think there is a good case to pursue federal contracts. There are a lot of good reasons
Oh,
around
yeah.
it.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is stability, especially when the government is stable in having a long-term contract. But just like I would say it does not get affected as much by market forces, which is where that security comes in,
Mhm.
as we do in the commercial space, because I think we have more flexibility on the commercial side, to get out of certain relationships based on what might be happening in the world or urgency, or you just have a really good set of lawyers that are helping you through those issues. But on the government side, I would say, there are situations where, at times of war, national emergency, things like that, where that could drastically change someone's contract. Moving money, if money has to be reallocated, that can cause a significant impact on some contracts versus others, where it could be positive on one end, very negative on another.
Hmm.
Or, what we're seeing now with even just transition every 4 years, there's transition, there's administration changes, all of these things that become very cyclical, and we should be prepared for it. But if you notice, and if you love scouring LinkedIn, the same complaints happen every single year, right? Please do not post solicitations around Christmas time. Oh my gosh, it's fiscal year end. Now we have to do all of these things. Oh my gosh, it's administration changes. What does that mean for solicitations? There's a government shutdown. We are not going to have a budget in time. We've been on a CR almost every single fiscal
Yeah,
year. So
yeah,
it's not
and
like it's a
bad
new
comedy.
problem, but for someone that's getting into the space fresh, they may not know that this happens almost every year. So for them, the panic starts. Like, what does this mean? There's a government shutdown. And this happens a lot of times with, people that might reach out to me, or people that whose articles I read, or like businesses that I talk to. Oh, I just got into the government space, or I'm just trying to get into the government space, and I hear that there's a government shutdown. I'm so worried about it. And you have to kind of bring them down. You're like, it's okay. This fear happens almost every year. We're going to be okay. It's going to pass last minute. We aren't hearing anything major right now, but you have to be able to prepare them to say, this isn't going to be the last time you're going to hear this. On the commercial side, you're not going to get that a lot. You're not going to get like, IBM is shutting down because they can't pass a budget, right? Those kinds of fears don't happen. You have the certainty that as long as they're profitable, and they haven't gone bankrupt, you're going to be okay. So you can project that a little bit more than I think sometimes with the government, with some of the political forces that are happening there. The other thing I think where there's kind of just this like push and pull when it happens with working with the government is I think understanding how you structure your contract, whether it's commercial or government, in order to have that kind of security. I remember when I was starting out in the space, it was very common to have 20-year contracts with, obviously there were option years in there, but you could be on contract, especially in shipbuilding, for 20 years. And
Sure.
you have security in knowing that you're going to basically be on those option years, unless you really, really messed it up, but
Yeah.
you're going to be on those option years. That hasn't been the trend. Shorter contracts, we fluctuate between fixed price and cost reimbursable all the time. But these trends do happen. And I think it's because also you see this consolidation and expansion when we see like the government-wide vehicles. You'll see for like 3-4 years, there'll be a huge push to put everyone on a vehicle. And then someone else comes in and they say, wait a minute, this is impacting competition. We got to pull these apart. So understanding those trends over time, especially not just in like a 5-year period, in like a 30-year period, you start understanding what is normal, what is unique, and what do you prepare yourself emotionally. And that's where you have to find people that you can trust. You have to find resources that you trust, reports that you can read to really fully understand that. And I think that's what makes government contracting so much more complicated than it would for a commercial contract. There's no such term as color of money when it comes to commercial contracting. Money is green, you get paid, you are happy about it on the commercial world. On the government world, you have to know the code for the money. You have to know the purpose for the money. You have to know how long that money is obligated for, or how long it's good for. There's a lot of details that go along with that $1 bill that you're expecting to get funded. You have to know the difference between the different lines in your contract, of what they mean, how they're funded, how they can be used, how you can bill to them. All of these little things that are in the Federal Acquisition Regulations, are in the OMB circulars and regulations. These are the things that make it so hard and make it seem like government contracting is so unique. And again, it's because it's written out and it's across multiple websites, across multiple agencies, organizations, sure, departments, that for a small business or a large business even that's trying to get into the space, it's overwhelming. That's a lot of reading that you have to do. And traditional lawyers, right, unless they go into the government contracting space, a corporate lawyer is not going to be familiar with the Federal Acquisition Regulations and their impact. They're not going to be familiar with filing a protest because there's processes to that. So there's even a learning curve there. So I think those are all things that are also important to understand. I know we're oversimplifying a lot of it for purposes of this, but there's so much that you can delve into. But it's important to understand at the very base, at the very ground level, you're starting out at a contract. You're starting out with the legal term of a contract, which is the agreement between the two parties. The things that are in that contract, how it's administered, how it's regulated, all of those other things that I think make that distinction between the two. There's where you really have to dive deep and make that comparison chart to say, is it worth it for me to go into this market? And just like a business has to make that decision if they're entering a new industry, because there's regulations for entering certain industries, as you know, they have to make that decision not only with the federal, state, and local governments, but they have to make that decision with every agency there. Is it worth for me to work with Department of Defense? Is it worth for me to work with the state of Virginia education system? Those are decisions. You are entering new markets, and you have to know the compliance requirements, the regulations, the best practices when doing business, not only with that entity, but with that specific office.